Hello everyone, this is Scott Cook, and this is another episode of my Interstellar Space Program, Episode 2. In this episode, we deal with antimatter and how to collect it, specifically. We're also going to be putting a large space station up into space. It's going to be a staging point for all of my interstellar ventures across the cosmos, across the Kerbal system. So this is basically a large can of fuel. That's really all it was designed for, using KW rocketry parts. Which also, because it's nice, long, and big, it also provides some real estate for a microwave transceiver and a lot of heat radiators, which will come in handy later. Other than that, it's not really that interesting. All the really interesting parts are going to be coming up in the next module, or in the next section of the space station, that are going to have to deal with my power generation in space. They're going to deal with the actual antimatter manufacturing, and it's also going to provide me an opportunity to show you some of the interstellar parts that, again, have some really interesting complexity to them. So I've got the hexagonal panel on the side here, and there's one on the opposite side as well, as it's my microwave transceivers. We looked at those in the last episode. However, these ones are smaller. The great big ones I used in my last episode were the endgame ones, because the surface area that you can face towards a transmitter will also help improve efficiency. I didn't put the big ones on this because, as try as I might, I found that the real estate wasn't there for them. They were just too problematic. So we went with the smaller ones. They'll come in handy in antimatter production, because when we start manufacturing it, it's one of the most power hungry things you can do in the game. I mean, there's some things to trump it, but it still takes about 5 gigawatts of constant power to produce antimatter at full capacity. Now, the nice thing about this game is that antimatter, even if you don't have that much power available, antimatter will still be produced, just at a lesser rate. And we'll get more into that when I actually bring up the science station. But first things first, we got to get this gas can orbiting the planet safely. And I've got less than a G of thrust in this engine that I'm using, because liquid fuel is very heavy. Anyone who's flown Kerbal Space Program is probably aware of that. So I've got less than 1 thrust to weight ratio with this engine, so I got to make sure it gets up safely. However, it does. It's not a big concern. I made sure I had enough. And from there, we'll just open some solar panels. Some of you may question why I still use the vanilla solar panels in some of these things, and that's because KSP Interstellar designed megajoules, which is the electrical power, and electrical charge to be two independent resources. For a conversion rate, megajoules is equal, or 1 megajoule is equal to 1,000 electric charge, and it can go back, so you can charge your regular electric charge with generators. However, you can't go the other way. That being said, there's some situations or setups you can do that will actually convert electrical charge back into megajoules, and I'll get into that in my next episode when we get into some more advanced ways of generating power rather than just launching huge reactors into space. Now, this vehicle is just a basic tug. I'm just launching it straight into space to do my space stations. However, there's nothing really that special about it. It's not using any KSP Interstellar, so let's just go straight to the docking maneuver here. So just coming into a rendezvous with the first part of the space station here, I'm just going to connect the tugger, whatever you want to call it in. Right now we've got Bill and Jeb flying, and they're the first two Kerbals that are going to be manning the space station. However, the next section is going to be bringing along mostly habitation and or workspace. I'm using the push, the retro thruster design that I used in a previous tug from my last series. I really did enjoy that. However, I've changed from the stock Minerva engines to these engines I found in KW rocketry that are probe engines. They provide a little bit more thrust, still very, very efficient, and provides some very useful for doing orbital maneuvers like this. This tug was not going to be expected to travel very far, and it will stay with the station for as long as I have it, just to do all those little odd jobs that you need a space tug to do. We'll get a nice look at the gas can from here as well. I'm going to just fold in some solar panels because I don't want to break them off. Where the docking ports on this are parallel to it, so I got to come in over top of either the microwave transmitter or something. I'm curious to test if blocking the microwave transmitter with a chunk of your ship actually affects its efficiency, which is something I'm going to make a note of testing later. I don't think it does. But it'll be interesting to know for sure, and I'll get back to you guys on that once I have an answer for you. So while we're finishing this docking maneuver here, I'm going to just sidestep and talk a little bit about a part that most people immediately associate with this mod, and that's the warp drive. In the game, it's called an Alcubierre drive. It's based on a warping space-time in order to actually move your vessel. I'll get more into it in the next episode, and I really don't want to jump ahead too much with it or focus too much attention on it, because it's a great part, it's a lot of fun, but this mod has so much more to offer besides warp drive. Some people say it's OP. I don't think so. I mean, it's debatable. If you're doing a game by discovering science and unlocking everything that way, it's one of the very last things you can get if you use the tech tree that comes with the mod. It's all really cool. Anyway, we'll just finish orientating this gas can, and I do a little bit of orbital adjustments to it because it's not exactly where I want it, but it will be momentarily. And we'll just breeze over that. Anyway, now we're getting to the fun part. This is the antimatter factory portion of my space station. The science lab in the middle that I've got my mouse cursor on will actually manufacture it. Does several things, but we'll get into that later. The two arms I have sticking out have two fusion reactors in the middle, and they have two generators on either end of them. Now, if you're going, why would you do something like that? It's because fusion reactors produce two products. They produce heat, like every other reactor, and they also produce charged particles, and depending on the fuel, that ratio will change. Now, the heat can be utilized by the generators, and that's great, but the charged particles are unique to fusion. Nothing else creates them. We'll get more into that in a little bit later. But for one thing I gotta remember, or I gotta remind everyone, is if you're using the science lab, is to put your kerbals in it so that you don't launch without it, because if it's empty, it's useless. So I picked the two least stupidest guys as my scientists, and then one really stupid guy they can use as a gerbil, if they need them. See the effects of antimatter when directly applied to a kerbal's face. Anyway, so I'm just going to show you here right now. If you fusion reactors need about 7 megajoules of power to jumpstart their reactions. Now, as you can see here, I tried to turn them on without any power stored up, and obviously they didn't fire, they didn't do anything. And we'll get into that. That's another way I can take advantage of my microwave relays. I can use the relay on the gas can in space to jumpstart my fusion reactors. Now let's just get up there and we'll get more into that as well. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the charged particles versus the heat that these generate. Fusion reactors only come in two sizes. They come in very small, and they come in the 1.25 size. They don't get any bigger. But they're still very useful for that. They're also, because they produce two products, have some interesting uses that the other two reactors don't. For example, the heat energy that any reactor produces can be used for either electricity or for thrust, depending upon what type of engines or what is attached to them. When you're dealing with charged particles, they can only be utilized for electricity through generators. Now, generators also have a tweakable in the vehicle buildings. They can be set to two modes. They can either be set to take advantage of heat, or they can be set to take advantage of charged particles. The difference being is if they're taking advantage of charged particles, the efficiency is 85%. So 85% of the charged particles can be converted into megajoules, whereas heat reactions at best are about 60%. And that's after you've upgraded to the most powerful upgrades that your electrical generators can have. Before that, if you're in an unupgraded generator, you can only harness about 30% of the heat energy. So fusion are very interesting and dynamic in that regards. Makes them very useful for long-term spacecraft in some situations, because they can be used for thrust and electricity at the same time without diminishing the capacity of the other. And I do build that into one of my vehicles later in this episode. I'll get a little bit more into that. So getting back to the antimatter factory we've got going on here, I've got two generators taking advantage of these fission reactors. One's turning heat energy into electricity, the other's turning the charged particles into electricity. Overall, it gets me more power, period. Now, when we get into different fuel sources that some of these reactors can use, I'll get a little bit more into some of the interesting things you can do with them, a bit more specific details, but for now, that's pretty much all you need to know. The other advantage of having two generators on either side is generators also act like batteries a little bit in the Interstellar mod, meaning they hold energy. So that can also be useful if you need to store a lot of energies, especially if it's in the megajoules, as you need to carry along a lot of generators. Fortunately, generators aren't very heavy by comparison, but it'd still be nice if the Interstellar guys built an actual megajoule battery into the game. That would be, I think that would be useful. Just a suggestion. Anyway, we're going to finish this docking maneuver here right away. I'm going to get started producing antimatter, and then I can actually start to show you some more features of this mod with regards to the microwave transmissions, and I can show you just how you can utilize a lot of this power, because the first episode I was just putting a lot of power into space. I really didn't have much use for it. This is going to be the first real test, or the first real drain on my relay network, and see just how well it operates. Now this is also a pretty big heavy beast. Like if you notice, that large section right underneath the science lab is actually the Antimatter Containment device. They're fairly heavy, and it's also the biggest one I can have. It stores the most antimatter. The other thing I gotta mention about antimatter is that the storage pieces that contain it, the storage holds, they require a constant charge. If they lose power, they do store a little bit, but if they lose enough power, any antimatter inside of there will blow up. So it's very volatile. You got to keep energy. You basically cannot not lose energy on them for long, or they will destroy your vehicle. Now that's another good reason, or that's another reason why I decided to use two fission reactors with 4 generators, is redundancy. With 2 fusion reactors and 4 generators, plus the power being beamed by my nuclear reactor throughout my relay, it's very unlikely that I'll lose power in my station so completely that my antimatter will blow up, which would really be, spectacular. And maybe for a quote-unquote science experiment, if I get some people interested, I can manually shut down the safeties and do a simulation, but we'll see. I didn't, I'm in this just to help you guys out, but if you're interested in explosions and there's enough people interested, just send me some messages and I'll turn off all the safeties and we'll see what happens. Anyway, just getting the tug attached on here, and then we'll be moving it around. Now, when it comes to building my space stations, I like to not leave RCS thrusters and things like that on them, because if I accidentally hit the button, I don't send a rotate. Now, some people are also going to say, well, you can manually shut them down if you click on them, and that's true. However, they also still add to the part count, and after I get my space station situated, it's very unlikely that I'm going to need to move it, and if I do, I will build a vehicle to move it. So what I'm going to do here is just get everything sorted out. I dropped the engines off the fuel section and then sent them back down to the planet, preventing Kessler syndrome. I like a neat orbit. I don't like space junk floating around there that I'd have to clean up later. And then I'll just move the gas tank so that it's more or less facing the antimatter section. Probably shouldn't call it an antimatter section because it's also habitats there that keep the Kerbals alive. They've got a crew can in there as well as the observation cockpit so that it can do some other things. I kind of realized after I did this and was watching the video for editing that there was a much better way I could have docked these. I should have actually grabbed the gas can with the tug and then just used it to connect to the antimatter. It would have been much easier because I've got the bigger docking port on it. But what's done is done. I eventually got it, and it wasn't too tough. I mean, aside from the wiggling, I just had to keep it from getting too wobbly, and it was alright. And yeah, just line her up and drive her in. Now, if you might have noticed here that I'm using the 3.75 parts for a lot of this. I've got the docking ports from KW Rocketry. They added some 3.75 docking ports, which have the capability of docking with the 2.5 ones, which are on the back of my tug. So they're like dual purpose, but they're also so much heavier, and they're so much bigger, but they're also so much more stable. In this case, it came in handy for building space stations, so I'll use them for that. I'll just wait here while I get finished up. I'm going to ditch the engine section off the antimatter section here in just a second, just get it out of the way, because once I do that, I no longer have any RCS thrust on the back, and then it really will wiggle. So get her lined up, move the section out of the way. Just get it just clear. Perfect. And then we go back to this and we just drive her home. Nice and clean and efficient. Just straight at him. Nice big target to hit. Open those radiators because I just wanted to make sure they don't get in the way. They usually don't clip or, you know, collide with anything, but I wanted to be sure. Alright. Nice and straight, and boom. We are connected. We have a complete space station. Now let's actually make some antimatter. Right after I drop this engine section back down to the planet so it's no longer junk in space. So now that all the housekeeping's done, let's fire this bad boy up. So first things first, we're going to deploy all the panels to deal with the waste heat. Now, I was doing it in the dark. As you can see there, for a second it had no power, and that's because on the dark side it hadn't had any energy and nothing was generating energy. So we just quickly turned on the microwave receiver and took some power, and now we've got light again. Started playing with it a bit. I decided that right around here I was going to just, you know, speed up time and get some more power in it. So we moved around to the light side here just so that I could get a better view for everyone. So now we've got the antimatter firing up all the reactors, making sure they're generating power. As you can see, it's starting to, the megajoules are just flying up there. And then we turn on the antimatter factory and boom, all gone. Like I said. So after it was all said and done, my fusion generators were generating just under 700 megajoules of power. Now the top relay is actually facing the network, but it's not facing it that well. As you can see here, turning the station to face the relay network improved the efficiency and the amount of power we got. So finally, I'm getting probably still close to, you know, 70 to 80% of the power to develop the antimatter from the relay. It's not being generated locally by this station, which is pretty cool. I mean, that gives you a lot of options. Now, my antimatter still isn't running at full capacity, but it's running at about 70% capacity right now with the power network that I have, which works. And I mean, you can see here that all my reactors and generators are running at full capacity, minus, of course, the efficiency loss of whatever, you know, particular energy source they're pulling out of the reactor. And you can see that the heat's starting to climb, but that'll eventually stable out. Now, there's another way to collect antimatter which is easier. That's by collecting it in the Van Allen belt. Now, this antenna that I put on one of my relays, I actually put it on both of them, is a dual spectrum magnometer. It can be used to collect science, but it can also tell you the flux or the radiation of the antimatter. That was that number there. As you can see, it was sitting at about 4 point something, and it was using an exponential, which I didn't really catch, but this is my Antimatter Collector probe. It's not much, but it is quite heavy because the Antimatter Collector is on the back end. Now for power, I'm also using 2 fusion reactors with thermo rockets underneath them, thermonuclear rockets underneath them. That will take advantage of the heat from the reactor, and the generator will use the charged particles to generate the electricity this thing will need. Again, this thing has to deliver its own electricity because it's got to contain the antimatter field within the containment device, plus the collector needs a constant charge to work. So it's pretty straightforward. I figured, again, I wanted to keep this one self-contained rather than tapping the relay network, the microwave relay network, just because right now with the antimatter I'm producing, it's at probably close to max capacity, and I would just start to diminish antimatter production at that point. For the most part, it's a pretty straightforward launch. I usually get these things out of the atmosphere conventionally, because in this configuration the thermonuclear rockets will only generate about 60 or just under 60 kilonewtons of thrust, which puts them on par with those nuclear engines from the vanilla game that everyone uses for long travel. The big difference though is the thermonuclear engines from Interstellar will have significantly higher specific impulse, and on top of that they can also use multiple types of fuel. Now, multiple types of fuel for different thrust to weight ratio, or excuse me, different thrust values, different ISPs. Liquid fuel oxidizer is kind of the baseline because from there it delivers probably the best specific impulse. When I do a video actually on the different fuels and some of the different features you can do with some of these engines, once we get this network built and the energy stabilized and I've got a few more things to play with, I'll do a video specific on some of the configurations you can set these things up with. So we're finally at the last stage, and we're just hitting the nuclear. And you can see here, their specific impulse was in the thousands. I didn't catch the actual number, but and it still generates about the same thrust as a nuclear engine. So, you know, highly efficient, highly useful for long-range duration, especially if it's just orbital maneuvering. You're not planning on using these to land or take off. The other thing is here too is I've got the Antimatter Collector that I was just playing with here to give you an idea of how much flux or how much antimatter's in the area. Now, very close to the planet, there's not going to be much because the atmosphere deflects most of it, and it gets trapped in the gravity well, but it doesn't, you know, get that close. I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about here once we finish organizing circularizing my orbit around the planet. Again, with low thrust engine, it takes a little while, and these are some very heavy components, but we're just about there. Okay, so let's take a look here. Now, deploying those radiators, we'll then take a look at the Antimatter Collector, because the nice thing is it'll tell you exactly what it's picking up in the area, as you can see here. So, antimatter's got power, or the Antimatter Containment's got power. We'll drop the magnometer, and it gives us an idea. We've got 1 point something from here, and you can see it actually correlates with the actual collector. It'll tell you the same thing. And we're just going to go out to one of my relay probes, and we'll drop its magnometer. As you can see, it's significantly higher. It's 4 point something. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a quick diagram of a Van Allen belt. Now, if you look here, the red areas are going to be the highest concentration of antimatter, and we want to get out and find that. So let's go. We're going to basically bring up our apoaps. We've seen it was fairly high at about 700 clicks, so let's just get her up there. And you can see some yellow dots on the planet behind me. That's actually another device that I've got attached to this probe, but I'll get more into that a little bit later. Alright, so now we got it on. We're just going to warp up or speed up time so we get out there. As you can see, my antimatter is slowly climbing as the further we get out, until it starts to stabilize at about, I think, 3.6. Now, that 3.6 takes a 24-hour period in order to actually collect that much. So the higher the better. So we'll just turn my periaps up and bring it up to about the same. As you can see, we've got, we're just going to basically be sitting up here collecting antimatter as this thing rotates it. Now, the beautiful thing about this mod is this will still collect antimatter even while I'm not loaded on it. It will still collect it in the background. Same with the power generation and transmission. It happens in the background so I can tie several devices together. It's just a beautiful mod. So anyway, that's really all I've got for you for this episode. We know how to collect antimatter. Once I get a sizable amount, we'll start to use it. It's probably the most straightforward of all the resources in this game, or in this mod. So anyways, that's going to call it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.